I didn't kill Lily and Jack.
It's been 6 weeks now since you've seen Lily and Jack. I just want to ask, how are you holding up?
It's been a long 6 weeks. I know that everybody basically in the world at this point is always wanting to know what happened.
Just 2 days ago on September 7th, 2025, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police arrested Daniel Martell in connection with the disappearance of two young siblings, Lily and Jack Sullivan, last seen in rural Pictou County, Nova Scotia. The children, ages 6 and 4, vanished from their home on May 2, 2025, igniting a massive search that yielded no trace of them in the days that followed or in the weeks since. This sudden arrest comes after weeks of careful investigation, including interviews with more than 54 individuals and multiple polygraph tests, suggesting that RCMP may now be acting on brand new, compelling evidence. Tonight, we unravel exactly how investigators pieced together the proof that brought Martell before the law, and what may lie ahead for this case. This is Guardian Intelligence, a crime scene analyst who has followed this case from the very beginning. And make no mistake, this case of missing children, Jack and Lilly Sullivan, has not only gripped Nova Scotia, but the entire nation of Canada. Jack was only 4 years old. Lily was 6. On the morning of May 2, 2025, both children vanished from their family home along Gairloch Road. In the rural community of Lansdowne Station, Pictou County, their disappearance triggered one of the largest and most emotional search efforts in the province's history. Volunteers combed forests, RCMP officers swept ravines with cadaver dogs, and helicopters scoured the landscape. Yet, despite these massive efforts, weeks turned into months and there were still no answers. The silence from RCMP was deafening for many. Critics wondered if investigators had missed key evidence or if the case was already growing cold. But as we've learned, silence often means strategy. Behind the scenes, investigators were conducting more than 50 interviews, administering polygraphs, analyzing hundreds of hours of surveillance footage, and processing forensic authorizations that we only now know about. And now, the story has taken a dramatic turn. On September 7, 2025, just 2 days ago, RCMP made a stunning move: the arrest of Daniel Martell, the children's stepfather. This arrest wasn't made lightly. It signals the discovery of new, compelling evidence strong enough to take a man into custody. After months of speculation, pressure, and heartbreak, in this video, I'll take you deeper into the case than headlines ever could. We'll examine what we know about Martell, how the RCMP's evolving strategy shifted over time, and what legal experts are saying may happen next. We'll also break down the psychological patterns hidden in Martell's public statements, and why those statements may come back to haunt him in a courtroom. Most importantly, we'll keep the focus where it belongs, on Jack and Lily, two children who deserve answers, justice, and a chance for their story to be fully told. Who is Daniel Martell? To the outside world, Daniel Martell was the stepfather of Jack and Lilly Sullivan, a man in his mid-30s living in rural Nova Scotia with his partner, Malahia Brooks Murray, and their young children. Two neighbors, he was a familiar figure, someone seen around the property, working odd jobs, sometimes quiet, sometimes outspoken. He lived on the margins, both financially and socially. Money was tight, opportunities were few, and according to those who knew him, tension inside the household was never far below the surface. But Daniel was more than just a background figure. From the beginning, he placed himself at the center of this story. On social media, he wrote long posts defending his role as a parent, proclaiming his innocence, and reminding the public that, in his words, the stepfather is always the prime suspect right off the beginning. He knew the spotlight was on him. He seemed almost resigned to it. But for investigators, his public words became more than just commentary. They were data points, windows into a state of mind. There were early red flags, reports of unexplained bruises on the children, what some described as black eyes, visits from child welfare authorities, who had been called to check on their safety, arguments between Daniel and Malahia that drew attention in their small community. These were never enough on their own to build a case, but they were warning signs, shadows of a family under stress. For a seasoned investigator, these details do not disappear. They form the backdrop against which every disappearance, every inconsistency, is measured. Now let's turn to the timeline, because in cases like these, every minute matters. It was the morning of May 2, 2025, when Jack and Lily were reported missing from their home on Gairloch Road in Lansdowne Station, Pictou County. That morning, between 8 o'clock and 9:40 a.m., Daniel Martell and their mother, Malahia, were together in the bedroom with their infant daughter. At some point during that window, the older children disappeared. When police were finally called around 10 a.m., panic had already set in. Neighbors later described unusual activity in the hours before. A vehicle they didn't recognize, headlights off, parked briefly near the property, then driving away. To some, it seemed unremarkable at the time. In hindsight, it was anything but. In missing persons cases, unexplained vehicles can become critical leads. The first thread investigators pull when trying to unravel a larger mystery. The RCMP response was immediate and overwhelming. Dozens of officers spread out across the woods, fields, and ravines surrounding the Sullivan home. Drones scanned from above. K-9 units swept the terrain. A command post was set up on site, coordinating hundreds of tips pouring in by the hour. Within days, nearly 160 volunteers had joined the search effort, combing ditches, creeks, and back roads in hopes of finding even the smallest trace, a scrap of clothing, a footprint, a trail that might lead them to Jack and Lilly. But nothing appeared. Not a thread, not a toy, not a single piece of evidence that could explain how the children vanished into thin air. On May 7th, just 5 days after the disappearance, RCMP scaled back the search. For the community, it was a gut punch. For the family, it was unbearable. And for Daniel Martell, it marked the beginning of a new phase. No longer just the stepfather, but the figure at the heart of every whispered suspicion. Behind the scenes, investigators pressed forward. They interviewed more than 50 people, relatives, neighbors, friends, even casual acquaintances. They administered polygraph tests. They pored over hundreds of hours of surveillance footage from gas stations, highways, and businesses in the region. They logged and assessed 488 separate tips from the public, and they obtained legal authorizations to seize devices, analyze phone records, and search digital footprints that could reveal where the truth was hiding. This wasn't random searching. This was methodical, deliberate, and precise. The RCMP knew that in a case with so little physical evidence, the devil would be in the details. A change of story, a contradictory alibi, a phone ping in the wrong place at the wrong time. Each small piece, on its own, meaningless. But together, they would form a puzzle, and the investigators were determined to solve it. And so the timeline of May 2nd, 2025, grew longer. It wasn't just a morning of panic. It was a morning of missed moments, unexplained sightings, and unanswered questions. A morning that would come to define Daniel Martell's future, and set in motion the chain of events that led to his arrest 4 months later. So, what changed? Why now? For long months, investigators appeared to be circling the same unanswered questions. Children missing, a stepfather under suspicion, a mother pleading for answers, and a community left with nothing but silence. Then, on September 7th, 2025, the silence broke. RCMP officers moved in and arrested Daniel Martell. For investigators to take that step, something decisive had to emerge. Some new piece of the puzzle that transformed suspicion into action. The RCMP has not revealed the exact nature of this evidence. That's deliberate. Holding back details protects both the integrity of their case and the possibility of a future trial. But in the world of criminal investigations, arrests of this magnitude rarely happen without one of 3 critical breakthroughs. The first possibility is forensic. This could mean DNA, fingerprints, or trace evidence, tiny particles of fiber, soil, or blood invisible to the naked eye but conclusive under a microscope. Something as small as a hair on a blanket, or a drop of blood in a car could alter the entire trajectory of the case. In no-body cases especially, forensic links are often the difference between hesitation and handcuffs. The second possibility is digital. Modern investigations rely heavily on technology. Phone records can reveal where a suspect was, down to the minute. Search histories can expose dark curiosities, queries about disposal, timelines, or alibis, GPS logs, traffic cameras, even the metadata hidden inside photos or messages. Each of these can contradict a suspect's version of events. And once a story starts to crumble under digital scrutiny, the whole structure often collapses. And the third possibility is testimonial. This could mean a witness who finally came forward, someone close to Martell who cracked under pressure or decided to speak out. It could also mean a previous witness retracting or altering their story, giving police a reason to connect Martell more directly to the disappearance of Jack and Lilly. Sometimes it's even a cellmate's confession, or a conversation recorded when the suspect thought no one was listening. In the case of Martell, any of these possibilities could apply. But let's look at the specifics of what we already know. From early on, investigators were struck by Martell's inconsistencies. He spoke about a missing pink blanket one day, then mentioned missing sweaters on another. To the average person, these might sound like forgettable details, but to investigators, shifting stories raise red flags. Why bring up items of clothing unless you believe they're significant? Why change your description unless you're testing the waters to see which story fits best? Some analysts suggest this could be anticipatory behavior, an attempt to get ahead of evidence that might later be discovered. If forensic tests were done on that blanket, or if fibers from the sweaters were recovered in unexpected locations, it could be enough to close the loop between suspicion and probable cause. Remember, RCMP had already executed multiple legal authorizations. That means they were gathering data from phones, searching the home, analyzing vehicles, and likely sending dozens of samples to the lab. Results like these don't always come back overnight. Sometimes it takes weeks, even months, for the evidence to return. That delay could explain why the arrest didn't happen sooner. There's also the question of strategy. RCMP are known for their patience. In Canada, one controversial tactic they have used before is the so-called Mr. Big operation. This involves undercover officers posing as members of a criminal organization, drawing a suspect into conversations where they reveal more than they intend. If Martell was subject to such a strategy, and if he made self-incriminating statements, that could easily explain the timing of his arrest. Another possibility is far simpler. Investigators waited until they had enough corroboration. In missing persons cases, RCMP often take the slow road, knowing that once an arrest is made, the clock starts ticking toward trial. They needed to be sure that when they acted, their evidence would withstand the courtroom. And so, while the exact nature of the evidence remains under wraps, what we can say is this: something substantial has changed. Something strong enough to convince investigators, prosecutors, and commanding officers that the time for waiting was over. Whether it was a forensic match, a digital contradiction, or a testimonial breakthrough, the new evidence against Daniel Martell has shifted this investigation into an entirely new phase. From here on out, we are no longer just talking about suspicion. We are talking about a man in custody, facing the weight of the Canadian justice system and the very real possibility of standing trial for one of the most haunting disappearances in Nova Scotia's history. Now, with Martell under arrest, the case moves from the streets and forests of Nova Scotia into the courts. Legally, the road ahead will be complex, and the stakes could not be higher. Martell is expected to face serious charges that may include abduction, unlawful confinement, or even homicide. Depending on how the Crown interprets the evidence, the first step will likely be a bail hearing. There, prosecutors will argue that Martell poses both a risk to public safety and a flight risk, given the gravity of the allegations. His defense, meanwhile, will push for release under strict conditions, attempting to paint him as cooperative, compliant, and unfairly targeted. Beyond bail, the next phase will involve forensic adversarial testing. Any forensic samples collected, whether from clothing, vehicles, electronic devices, or personal belongings, will be tested and retested by both the Crown and the defense. Each side will attempt to challenge not only the results but the methodology. Was the DNA contaminated? Was the chain of custody airtight? Were the digital records obtained with proper authorizations? In Canadian courts, these challenges are standard, and they often determine whether evidence is admissible at trial. Then come the motion hearings. Here, lawyers will argue over what the jury is allowed to see and hear. The defense may try to exclude Martell's past statements on social media, or to block testimony about his earlier struggles with finances, drugs, or family tensions. The Crown, in contrast, will push to introduce those very details as part of a larger pattern evidence, not of guilt in itself, but of context that explains motive, opportunity, and mindset. Importantly, this case could proceed even without the recovery of the children's bodies. Canadian law allows for prosecution on the basis of strong circumstantial evidence, especially when supported by digital or forensic corroboration. If investigators have secured phone records, placing Martell at suspicious locations, or forensic matches tying him to incriminating items, that may be enough. Courts have upheld convictions in no-body cases before, though they require meticulous presentation of evidence and a clear, compelling narrative from the Crown. But law is only one side of this story. The other is psychology. From the earliest days of the investigation, Martell made himself unusually visible. He posted on social media, gave statements, and presented himself as a father under siege. He spoke of attending recovery programs, enrolling in child welfare classes, and trying to be better. These comments may have been meant to project responsibility, to shape the public perception of him as someone working toward change. But investigators and psychologists know how to read between those lines, because behind those public claims were earlier admissions of drug use, of financial instability, of avoiding taxes, of living in a household marked by strain. To some, these contradictions paint a picture of a man trying to rewrite his own narrative in real time. They raise the possibility that his public words were less about truth and more about strategy, an attempt to distance himself from suspicion by overcompensating with declarations of innocence and reform. True crime psychology often highlights this pattern. When suspects say things like, "They'll pin everything on me," it can serve as a kind of projection. In essence, they are voicing aloud the very fear that investigators already suspect that they are, in fact, guilty. To professionals, such statements are not throwaway remarks. They are defensive maneuvers, ways of reframing a narrative before anyone else can define it for them. There's also the performative element. By speaking frequently, Martell may have been trying to maintain control of the narrative. Silence would have looked suspicious. Over-communication, on the other hand, allows him to flood the public space with his version of events. But over-communication has its risks. The more a suspect talks, the more contradictions emerge. Small inconsistencies, forgotten details, or sudden changes in tone can become powerful tools for investigators and prosecutors. Taken together, Martell's legal and psychological profile is deeply complex. On one hand, he presents himself as a man trying to reform, to comply, to cooperate. On the other, his past behavior, his public contradictions, and the very fact of his arrest point toward deeper issues. Issues that a court will now be asked to untangle. In the months ahead, we will see whether the Crown can weave its evidence into a story compelling enough to convince a judge and jury. But we will also see whether Martell himself can maintain the fragile mask. He has built the mask of the misunderstood stepfather, the man who insists he is innocent, while the evidence begins to suggest otherwise. With Martell now under arrest, the focus shifts to what lies ahead. The Canadian justice system moves deliberately, step by step. The first formal document to expect is the charge sheet, the list of offenses the Crown believes it can prove beyond a reasonable doubt. Once those charges are laid, Martell will appear in court for arraignment. In that hearing, he will be asked to enter a plea, guilty or not guilty. It is almost certain that his defense will advise him to plead not guilty, forcing the Crown to bring its case forward in full. From there, Martell will likely be placed on remand, held in custody while awaiting further proceedings. Meanwhile, his legal team will gain access to disclosure. This is a critical stage in any Canadian criminal case, the moment when prosecutors must reveal the evidence they intend to use. Every interview transcript, every forensic report, every piece of digital data seized during the investigation must now be shared with the defense. This transparency is a cornerstone of Canadian law, designed to prevent trial by ambush, but it also gives Martell's lawyers their first true glimpse into the strength of the Crown's case. After disclosure come the pretrial motions. These are the battles fought before the trial even begins. The defense may attempt to suppress statements Martell made on social media, arguing they are prejudicial. They may challenge search warrants, claiming investigators overstepped legal boundaries. The Crown, meanwhile, will push to admit as much evidence as possible, framing it as part of a larger narrative of guilt. And so, as we look ahead, the picture is clear. Legally, Martell's path winds toward arraignment, disclosure, and eventually, trial. Investigatively, the RCMP presses forward, unearthing every clue, chasing every lead, and considering the possibility of wider involvement. And emotionally, a community holds its breath, caught between hope for resolution and fear of what the truth may ultimately reveal. What comes next is not closure, not yet. What comes next is the slow, grinding machinery of justice. And in that machinery, every detail, every decision, every piece of evidence will matter. This arrest didn't happen out of the blue. It followed months of carefully gathered evidence and relentless investigation. But the truth isn't complete yet. The puzzle is still missing pieces, and justice depends on every one of them falling into place. We'll keep tracking this case, bringing you every update as new court documents surface and as the RCMP makes its next moves. If more revelations come to light, you'll hear them here first. So make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications, because the story of Jack and Lilly Sullivan is far from over. And together, we'll follow it to the very end.